I would like to call to order the Rail Safety and Community Enhancement, also known as RSCE Committee meeting of the North County Transit District for June 30th, 2023, which is today. Before we begin, I would like to inform members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page that in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. You must also register with the clerk by sending an email to clerk@nctd.org with the name and/or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. I will ask Suhil Rodriguez, clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Committee Chair Contreras.
Present.
Committee Vice Chair Hinsey. Committee Member Jenkins. Committee Member Bapatel. Here. That completes the roll.
Awesome. And Suhil will now provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures.
In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Awesome. And we also have board member Hinsey just joined us. And Suhil, do we have any public comments today?
No, madam.
All right. So since we don't have any public comments, at this time we are ending the public registration for general public comment. And before we go into specific items on the agenda for this meeting, I would like to first outline meeting protocols to make this meeting as efficient as possible. First, please hold your comments and/or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. Second, when the time comes for board member comments or questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order received. Flipping the page here. All right, we're going to get to our first agenda item, which will be an update on the Quiet Zone Implementation Manual. This manual is nearing completion. We are excited to have a preview of some of the information that it will contain. The preview will include information on risk calculations, cost estimates for typical safety measures, process timelines for development through the regulatory agencies, which there's a ton, and details regarding the recertification process for typical quiet zone infrastructure. Zachary Taylor, Signal Manager, will be presenting this item via Zoom. Zach, you have our attention. We love quiet zones and we want to know a lot more about them.
Thank you. You kind of stole all my thunder with the preview there, but I'll do my best to inform you on what we've got. All right, so just a reminder for those of you who aren't familiar why we have quiet zones in the first place. So this comes from a 2005 law that essentially requires trains to blow their horns for a minimum of 20 seconds prior to the arrival at a crossing. When the federal government put this into effect, I think they must have also realized that not all communities enjoy having that train community, so they also implement the ability for quiet zones to go into effect. And so because those are rather complicated, that is the purpose of this document that we are producing to explain to the communities and help us all understand exactly what alternatives there are available to hearing train horns. And so that is what the quiet zone study is about. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so as the board chair said, this is the purpose of the manual, is to inform stakeholders, guide them through the process of implementing a quiet zone, identify a lot of the information that is typically needed in order to determine whether such an endeavor would be, cost prohibitive, or whether there's resources available for it, all that sort of thing. So that is the purpose of this manual. We're going to go over today some of the most recent additions because we are in the draft final phase of this plan and expect to have it delivered somewhat soon. So if we go to the next slide, please. All right, so some of the additions that we're going to go over today that have been added since February An example of the quiet zone risk calculation, sample schedule that stakeholders can expect if they decide to go through with the quiet zone implementation process, as well as a cost estimator calculator, something that the cities and stakeholders can use to try to get a ballpark estimate of what costs might be associated with such a project. Pedestrian specific safety measures, and then a discussion around the affirmation process, which is the continuation, ensuring that your quiet zone once established remains in place. We can do the next slide, please. All right, so the quiet zone calculator is a tool that the FRA provides on a website, on the government website, and it is essentially a tool that helps you identify what are the different types of SSMs. We've covered these previously, supplemental safety measures, or ASMs, alternative safety measures, that might be required in order to meet a threshold of risk that would be allowable to implement a quiet zone. So this isn't the most user-friendly website, and so as part of the manual, we've included a manual for how to use this website, a step-by-step guide on exactly what the stakeholders would do in order to utilize this to the best of their abilities to get the most information out of it before needing to, potentially hire a third-party consultant, that sort of thing. So that is what the quiet zone calculator section of our manual is going to help the stakeholders do. We could go to the next slide. This is just an example from that website. This is after a lot of the information has been input. It's showing you some various things about the streets that we've selected here, in this case, Tamarack and Cannon. And the important information is down towards the bottom, where we're looking at the risk index with horns and the quiet zone risk index. So in the document, it's telling you, exactly what you're trying to accomplish there, reducing the risk index below that of the horns, so that the risk of the crossing in the corridor that we're trying to implement the quiet zone on is quantifiably lower than it previously was, even with the use of horns. We could go to the next slide. All right, so the next section is a detailed breakdown of an expected timeline or schedule for all the activities necessary to go from development of a concept forest quiet zone to the implementation and closeout. So this is broken into 5 major categories: concept development, final engineering, bids and proposals, construction, and then closeout. And each of those has subcategories that helps the stakeholders see all the exact steps, in the order that they would be required to be undertaken in order to get through this process. So this is provided in a Gantt chart in the manual, as well as more detailed information about each of these steps. And this is just the summary outline, but helps the stakeholders understand, this is a long process. This is a commitment, a long commitment to ensure that these things go through. Next slide, please. Okay, so when it comes to implementing a quiet zone, there are a number of different ways that we can ensure and retain safety. Among those are what I mentioned earlier, supplemental safety measures, and these are measures that the FRA has already deemed to be a safety improvement and are worth certain predetermined values when it comes to the crossing risk evaluation. And among those are crossing closures, which is often not financially doable because it may have to do with trenching or going over a roadway, which is not always doable. Then the more realistic things are 4-quadrant gate systems. So that would be in the cases of most San Diego subdivision crossings, the addition of exit gates. Also looking at gate channelization devices or medians to prevent vehicles from going around entrance gates. Get to the next slide. All right. So also included in the manual is a calculator to help the cities get a rough order of magnitude of the cost of this construction, right? So first they'll go through the calculator, try and estimate and figure out what are some of the improvements that you could make. And then you can go and take those improvements that allow you to reach the risk threshold and put them into the cost calculator to try and get an idea of, with all these things put together, how much in the ballpark are we thinking, construction on such a thing is going to cost. So it also, includes things that are ancillary to the actual construction themselves, such as there are associated costs with doing work around the rail, which is flagging, permits, and that sort of thing, oversight. So all of those are, we try to identify all of those in the calculator so that we can give the ability to create the best estimate possible before going to a third party to help with that. All right, next slide, please. This is just an overview of some of the items, because these are terms familiar within the railroad industry, but may not be something that the cities are used to dealing with. Just kind of visual representation of what is the pedestrian channelization fencing that we're talking about? Where does it, where could that potentially go, and where do the exit gates actually fit? So this is an overhead view of one of our crossings, as well overlaid with some of the potential quiet zone safety implementations. And I think one of our comments in the next draft is to improve the quality of this photo so that it's a little bit more readable. Next slide, please. All right, and so finally, once we do get through all of the construction and implementation, obviously the cities want to ensure that those quiet zones stay in place. So there is a section in the manual that goes over what is required to affirm that these quiet zones do stay in place. So it depends on what type of safety measures are used. If you only use supplemental safety measures, which are the pre-approved FRA measures, then the frequency with which you need to reaffirm is less frequent, not as often, 4.5 to 5 years. If you use the ASMs, the additional, maybe I'm getting that wrong, the other safety measures, the additional safety measures, alternative, that's what it is, then you have to do it a little bit more frequently. And so this essentially just requires that the jurisdiction go out, ensure that the safety measures are still in place, do another traffic analysis, and then provide that information to the FRA to say that, hey, we're still doing what we intended, and things are still safe based on our original calculations here. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the next steps? The manual is in the final draft form, and we're getting comments from the NCTD staff. Those will be provided back to the engineer. They'll be implemented, and then we will have a final draft that will be shared this fall with the board and local jurisdictions. And I think that's my last slide before questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Sahil, do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. So with that, at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item, and I'll turn over to the committee and see if any of the board members have comments. All right, take it away.
Suhail, if somebody's talking, I'm unable to hear them at the moment.
Thank you. I have several questions. On page 4, where you talked about the assessment that goes on and not being user-friendly, is that being, I know that's not our assessment, but is that being reviewed by anybody to make it more user-friendly, or is that not an option?
That's an FRA administered website. It's not something we've reached out to them on. I guess that was just my personal anecdote. There are multiple selections, I think, in the registry for NCTD. So selecting the right one and going through the right steps to ensure that you are able to get to the crossings that you're interested in, we found not to be straightforward, which is why we decided to make sure that it was a detailed section of the manual to ensure that the stakeholders could have success trying to do that.
Okay. And then I think there was discussion about this before when we started talking about these. When you talk about all crossings, so give an example. If a quiet zone goes from, could it go between jurisdictions? Or is a quiet zone only within a jurisdiction? And if there's multiple crossings and you're only concerned about mainly one of those, you still have to do all of those crossings in that zone. Is that correct?
So first question, a quiet zone can span multiple jurisdictions. And when we talk about a quiet zone, is from a start point to an end point. There are details in the manual, lots of details that I haven't gotten into, but details about the minimum size of a quiet zone, what is allowed to constitute the beginning and end of a quiet zone, as well as what you're aiming for across the entire quiet zone when it comes to risk mitigation. So if your quiet zone entails, let's just say 4 grade like road crossings, that will constitute, and I hope I'm getting this all right, but if not, it's again detailed in the manual, that constitutes some fixed finite numerical risk index. It may only require that you do improvements at, say, 3 of the crossings in order to reduce that index, even with the elimination of train horns. So that is what the FRA website helps you identify. And the website and the manual will help you figure out exactly what you're aiming for and what the restraints are on you based on the laws. So, say there's one crossing that would be very difficult to, implement any of these supplemental safety measures out. It may be the case that doing so at 3 others might put you below the risk index to allow for that to be an acceptable situation. Did that answer your question?
So it maybe doesn't have to be all.
That is my understanding, correct.
Okay. And then on the next page, where you gave this index situation, is there an ideal number that we're looking for in that split? So like, for instance, on this one, it shows with horns 46,000, without 40. So the difference is 5. Is there like a minimum number that you're shooting for to hit, or is it not that simple?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not super familiar with that calculation, but my understanding is that the FRA doesn't provide the formula for how that's generated. They just provide the calculator to get it out. So I think that it may be the case that if you only had 2 crossings in your quiet zone, that number may be far lower. And if you had 8, it may be, 8 times as, 4 times as high as the other one.
So there's not a minimal differential number they're looking for.
Not that I am aware of, no.
Okay. And then on the next page where you're talking about estimated timeline of 60 months. So that would be your expectation. In the past, what's been the actual? Has it been done really in 5 years?
I think that since my time with NCTD, the only example of a quiet zone going into effect was Oceanside, and I do believe the entire timeline on that one was around 5 years.
Okay. Almost done. Sure, someone's going to talk about that. Let's see. Oh, when you have the affirmation process, In your experience, maybe not only with NCTD, but just in general with entities that have these, in your experience, is there a percentage of zones that have had to be removed from being a quiet zone, or are they typically affirmed to continue?
I've only heard of the one instance of a quiet zone being put on pause while the safety measures were re-implemented, and that was due to, I believe, them essentially not being maintained and going out of service. So I think that, generally speaking, this is it's mostly just a clerical administrative issue to keep these things moving. Now, what would prevent that, I think, is if there were drastic traffic pattern changes that resulted in a risk index calculation change. So part of the affirmation process is getting a new traffic study. So that may be something that the cities want to be aware of. If there is some plan for significant development or significant change in traffic that could change the traffic studies, it may be worth putting into the calculator, we expect it to go up by X%. Let's see what happens to our risk index number, right? That way we can say, if our traffic changes by 50%, we're still in a safety zone. Or if it changes by 50%, then we understand that we would have to go back and reevaluate that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Yes, in Encinitas, we're eager for a quiet zone. It's overdue, and so it's helpful to get all the information that we can. Just a few questions. They're not super technical. They're just more about process. So one question, this might be for Lillian or Tracy, but Encinitas completed a study several years ago. How will this manual affect our efforts? Does it supplement anything that was missing for us or move us any closer to perhaps a multi-jurisdictional quiet zone?
I don't think that your study would have any impact on the overall process. I think the study just takes into consideration the needs of the community and what it is that you want to do. And then that translates into the project as it proceeds with design and such.
Okay, so this manual helps us because now we've engaged NCTD and perhaps other member cities that we need, and gives us more of a clear path of where we're trying to go.
It helps with the guidance, yes, through the entire process.
Okay, good. And then my second question is, once the manual is complete, what are the next steps that we can expect that NCTD is going to be asking of us so that we can be ready to go once it's complete and that information is available?
I think it's more of us pushing the manual out to the local jurisdictions so that you have this playbook, if you will, on how to proceed. In the next presentation, I'm going to get into a little bit of board policy and roles and responsibilities that'll discuss how we can support and advance projects. Is there anything that we would be specifically waiting for from you? There really wouldn't be. It's how we can support you.
Any other questions that have come up? Comments, concerns? Okay. It's my turn. I just have a few questions. First of all, I don't actually know what a tactile paver is. I have an idea, but can someone tell me what that is?
Yeah, so those they're usually yellow in color. They have little bumps on them.
Okay.
And you'll often see them right before a swing gate.
Okay. So it wouldn't be, they would be localized to like a very small area versus like extended all over the place, right?
Correct. They're usually, I think that their intent is to help the visually impaired for something that, since we often use colors and that sort of thing with paint, since they're not going to be able to benefit from that, I think it's generally the case to say, hey, you're changing where where you are is changing. And this is no longer a safe area until you reach another tactile paver. So it's a notification device, and they're fairly small.
Okay. Yeah, no, I wasn't sure, but it's matching the visual that I have in my head now that you've explained that. I do have a question regarding the draft. It says that this will be pushed out to local jurisdictions, but is this going to be a public document that is public facing that can be accessed on the NCTD website as well? The reason that I ask is that sometimes, not all of us in our local jurisdictions have a really strong majority that just want to move forward with things. And sometimes it's really important to have public engagement. So just a quick question about the draft and how the public can engage with what will be the final product of the manual.
It is going to be a public document, and we will work on finding the right spot for it on our website so that it's accessible.
Awesome. Yeah. And any kind of, push out on social media once it's done, I highly recommend that. I know that there's a lot of folks across NCTD's jurisdiction that have wanted quiet zones, whether they're on the 78 and they're looking at the Sprinter, or they're along the coast and want a quiet zone because of the coaster. So awesome. I look forward to that. And I recall when Oceanside was here talking about their process, they spoke a little bit about the FRA calculator, and that there's not necessarily and tell me if I'm recalling this wrong, but that there wasn't necessarily a warning that it was updated. And so in the manual, is there a section that outlines best practices, kind of like an FAQ, where it would say, hey, jurisdiction, you should really, be checking this FRA calculator, not just one time, maybe not even just 2 times, but have it like a systematic part of the process where it's being just rechecked. Is that incorporated in the draft? I haven't seen the draft, so.
I don't have the whole thing committed to memory, obviously, but I think I recall. I can't remember if it was a discussion that we had about that, or if it was something I read. So that we can, that can be a note that we take for the revision to final.
Awesome. Yeah, I just think it's, outside of the knowledge that we have from just having that conversation where Oceanside came in and gave us a little bit of the realistic breakdown and some of the tips that they had to, make it a smoother process. It was, checking the FRA calculator. It was also something about flagging. So I just want to make sure that those are those little tips and tidbits are somehow in this manual, because it could be really helpful for our different jurisdictions to have that type of reference, since they, may not have that institutional knowledge like we do. So yes, I would highly recommend that.
And thank you, Chair. One of the things that we do have in the quiet zone is it articulates all the different types of costs. And in the manual, the cost sample includes flagging. So that flags for the local jurisdictions that's something we should also be budgeting for. So I think that cost estimator will be really helpful in managing expectations about what the cost of construction as well as long-term operation will be.
Awesome. Yes. And yeah, because I'm thinking, that the Oceanside presentation was just so good. And so I see it really as like a case study almost, that if there was something included in the manual that was like a case study component that had, these are some of the obstacles that we heard from Oceanside, and, just things to look out for. Right. So I think that could be beneficial. And then in talking about kind of parsing out the cost, does the manual get to the question of what the cost of the affirmation process is, or potentially what cost variables could be part of the affirmation process? Because you said something about a traffic study, and those aren't free. So as a jurisdiction, we'd have to be able to maybe set aside, for someone who's going to go into the quiet zone process, that's a part of the discussion that a local council will have to say, hey, there's the potential that we would need a traffic study. So at the front end, what we want to do is start saving for that across, just to have that as a fund, a separate fund. So is there anything that speaks to that in the manual?
At this time, that is not included, but we can certainly include a rough estimate acknowledging that it will be entirely dependent on the length of a corridor because the traffic study has to cover the number of crossings. So we can provide an estimate of what it would be for one crossing and then a multiplier, taking into account that costs will increase over time.
Right. Hopefully inflation is a little bit better, but
I would just say that generally NCTD tried to provide cost estimates for railroad specific items. And since the traffic study would generally be something that the city undertakes, that's not something that we would have as much expertise on the costs of. So obviously calling out the duration under which those would need to be conducted. And we also provided a template letter for the affirmation process, but really, from my recollection, the only cost incurred during the affirmation process is the traffic study, and everything else would be pretty, very, very low cost, just a couple of hours of, city time type thing. And I think that's why at the moment it's not included.
Okay, yeah, I just highly recommend, even though we're not the experts, NCTD isn't the expert in it, but our cities aren't the expert on quiet zones. So there's a little bit of a gap. And even if we're cognizant here at NCTD that X, Y, and Z are factors, I don't even necessarily think we need to even provide a cost estimate, just knowing that, hey, this is a variable, this is a variable, this is a variable for the affirmation process. And then the cities at least they can flag that and they can incorporate that into the process and the budgeting mechanism. So that way everybody's on the same playing field. But I think it's really important because it's just not something that our jurisdictions, for the most part, I think Encinitas is way ahead of the game. But I know in Vista, we are not experts in this at all. So it would be really important for city staff and for the council, when this becomes a council discussion, that there are just very, it could be a very brief outline of these different variables that could come into play. And not necessarily that all of them are going to come into play, but there could be a traffic study. There could be this, depending on, are you following the standards? Because that's also, I think a critical component of what the local jurisdiction conversation is going to be. Like the discourse is going to need to include, hey, if we do standardized stuff, then it could be a lower cost over time because you might not need to have a traffic study every 2.5, 3.5 years, right? I'm just trying to figure out how this discussion would happen outside of this building when we're in our local councils, and what kind of information we would need as a council member or a mayor to be able to make those decisions. And I think just having a really succinct outline of potential costs and plans that we would need. I think it's just beneficial. And yeah, I'm not too stressed about us having a really solid cost estimate. The cities can take care of that, but just so that they know, hey, this is a checklist that might come into play. And then it says that the city signs off on the during the affirmation process. Is that internally? Would that be the traffic engineer, or does that have to go to council for a sign off, or both?
My recollection of the samples that we have seen is it is a city official that signs off. It did not go to council. It's an affirmation. It's basically a signature that everything in the packet is true and accurate. Okay, awesome. Well, with that, I don't have any questions, but we do have some more questions. So Board Member Hinsey, you have the floor.
Thank you. One question about the city's efforts to do some projections and planning. In the city of Encinitas, we're trying to understand two future scenarios. One being the future rail traffic, because we understand there'll be changes in frequency. And then the other one is for our local planning, in that we are going to be adding hopefully at-grade crossings. And also we know that there will be increased volumes with more residents of our city, apartment buildings being constructed. So when we're looking at attempting to project changes in the future, what's the best way to do that as part of the 5-year look ahead? Are we attempting to capture the projected scenario, or is it that we're planning for the moment that we're in when we start the process?
Zach, I don't know if you have any information as it relates to from an application perspective.
No, I think I would just kind of go back to what I said earlier, which was it's probably best just to play around, given your expectations a bit with the calculator, to see how changing the traffic study impacts the risk assessment. So if you can, for instance, double traffic over a crossing without having much of an impact on your risk assessment, then that gives you a pretty good feeling that the chosen supplemental safety measures are going to be, rock solid for you for a long time. If doing that, exceeds the risk assessment, then I think it becomes a cost benefit analysis of how soon do we actually expect that to happen versus how much additional funding would it cost to go with an additional supplemental safety measure that may cost more money now, but if we don't have to go and reopen some construction 5 years down the line because there's additional traffic, then we're saving money in the long run. I think that's the only. I don't think that there's a hard and fast. Here's how you do it type thing, because how large the quiet zone is, how many crossings it entails, that sort of thing, is almost certainly going to affect the overall risk calculation. So, doing such an exercise on a 2-crossing quiet zone versus an 8-crossing quiet zone may have very different results. And therefore, I think it's hard to give a generalized answer, but it is something with the tools. We hope that you wouldn't have to be spending a whole bunch of money with a contractor to do that you'd have the tools to be able to, make those evaluations based on the city's plans at the time.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
All right. Any other questions? This is our last meeting. So no. Okay. I know the RSCE committee is the best. Okay. Well, I appreciate the work that has gone into clarifying the process for implementing and operating a quiet zone, and I look forward to seeing the final version of the quiet zone manual. There is no vote required for this item. It is informational only. So thank you so much, and we're going to move on to our next item, which is an overview of board policy number 18, railroad safety and community enhancement projects. This presentation will highlight key sections of the board policy and explain the various requirements of local jurisdictions contemplating railroad-related projects and the collaborative role NCTD plays in the process. Tracy Foster, Chief Development Officer, will be presenting this item. Tracy, you have the floor, and I know we've been waiting for this one, so thank you so much for putting this together. We've had a lot of comments across our meetings about how we want to see, what we can do here at NCTD and how that can link up to what the local jurisdictions are doing. So I really appreciate this item. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Over the last several RSCE committee meetings, we've had numerous references to board policy 18. So it is important for us to take a deeper dive into this board policy and further explain the roles and responsibilities associated with project costs, maintenance, and the sometimes very confusing topics of insurance and indemnification. Okay, so let's begin with the purpose of the policy. Board Policy 18 provides a framework for NCTD's cooperation on locally initiated rail-based projects that a county, city, state, or other organization, which we collectively throughout this presentation refer to as local jurisdictions, may undertake in order to improve railroad safety and enhance the surrounding community. The projects within the scope of the policy are generally limited to rail crossings, wayside horns, and quiet zones, but can be expanded at NCTD's discretion. The policy intends to stimulate collaboration, which promotes successful project implementation and allows for increased opportunities for project funding. Because local jurisdictions best understand the needs of their communities and retain land use authority, it puts them in the best position to prioritize and design projects that will fulfill those needs. The local jurisdiction, therefore, is designated as the lead agency for the project implementation. NCTD and SANDAG have the benefit of understanding and implementing projects in the railroad right-of-way, and therefore can serve in providing project management support. Of course, there's numerous capacity enhancement type projects such as double tracking or grade separations where SANDAG or NCTD may serve as the lead agency. Discussions about project ideas, projects in process, or just sharing of information as to what is happening in a community is great collaboration and works in helping to achieve community goals and safety along the right-of-way. It also can play a significant role relating to funding, whether it be allowing opportunities to be more competitive in seeking grant funding or leveraging costs associated with project planning, design, and construction. To support this great collaboration, MOUs are strongly encouraged and is a way for us to outline what each party will contribute in order to reach the shared goal. The lead agency for the project is also the party that's responsible for securing the funding. So costs associated with the services that NCTD provides in its support role must also be considered by the lead agency when securing funding, as the delivery of these services by NCTD must be cost neutral. That being said, NCTD may, at its sole discretion, also contribute funding towards a project deemed to be a high priority and that one that will increase safety and improve NCTD's overall rail operations. So in breaking down a project and the application of Board Policy 18, this is a representation of some of the high-level roles and responsibilities of local jurisdictions serving as the lead agency. In the project development stage, the local jurisdiction is going to identify the need or needs, funding, and how the project may be approached. A project study report helps to frame the project and also serves as a good tool in providing cost estimates and backup in seeking grant funding. And as previously mentioned, this is also the right time to get the MOU in place. The project implementation stage will include the local jurisdiction completing design, seeking regulatory approvals that Zach had gone through and will be in our implementation manual, securing use of NCTD property, and completing construction. Within Board Policy 18, a cost and maintenance agreement is referenced, and we refer to that as a license agreement. They're basically one and the same. Once the project improvements are constructed, and as it will be established in the license agreement, the local jurisdiction will be responsible for all non-railroad improvements, the wayside horn, if applicable, and the crossing itself. Next slide, please. As previously stated, NCTD will serve in a support role to the local jurisdiction. So you're not alone in doing your project. We collaborate on funding opportunities, project study reports, and help drive the development of the MOU. As the project advances, NCTD will need to review all of the designs to ensure that the planned improvements are aligned with NCTD operations. And as the local jurisdiction proceed with regulatory approvals, NCTD will also have to sign off on those submissions. NCTD will allow the use of its right-of-way through the license agreement. And as the project moves to construction and to ensure all work is safe and not in conflict with operations, permits and support services are authorized. Support services includes things like flagging, signal support, that type of thing. And lastly, once constructed, NCTD will be responsible for all railroad equipment improvements. So just a little bit more on the license agreement. Again, this is an agreement serves a few purposes. First, it allows for the use of NCTD property. However, in determining if the use is approved, NCTD must ensure that it does not interfere with its continuing control over the property and its ability to carry out NCTD operation. That's also a requirement of the Real Estate Board Policy 11. The license agreement also documents permitting requirements for construction as well as maintenance responsibility of each party that we just reviewed. Okay, this is full of a lot of words here, and I'm certainly not going to read all of them, but want to point out that this is the indemnification language that is within Board Policy 18. That some of the key points that I just want to point out on this slide, as well as the next slide, is the indemnities. So you'll note that the city or local jurisdiction will indemnify not only NCTD, but its board and other operators on the rail, including any entities performing maintenance or dispatch work. The indemnity liability, loss and expenses includes reasonable attorney fees and defense claims, which is any type of claim. So it could be personal injury, property damage, or bodily injury, etc. Next slide. So these are really the key points of that big indemnification language. And that is the local jurisdiction indemnifies for its failure to comply with the federal rule or any negligent act or omission on the local jurisdiction's part that's required by the federal rule and related to the establishment and operation of the pedestrian crossing, quiet zone, or wayside horn system. NCTD, on the other hand, indemnifies the local jurisdiction for negligent acts or omissions under or in connection with the work, authority, or jurisdiction delegated to NCTD under the terms of the license agreement. That's between NCTD and the local jurisdiction. Okay, on to insurance requirements. So for the local jurisdiction during construction, the local jurisdiction will be required to have general and railroad protective liability insurance that is specific to those construction activities. The work to be performed is reviewed by the risk and safety chief, who determines the amounts and coverage. And again, it's specific to the construction activities. These insurance types and limits are required and included in the right of entry permit agreement. So post-construction, the local jurisdiction will only be responsible for maintaining insurance of non-railroad facilities that are in the pedestrian crossing and will name NCTD as an additional insured. NCTD, on the other hand, will insure for the railroad specific facilities and name the local jurisdiction as an additional insured. If there is any additional incremental cost for this insurance that NCTD is going to carry and maintain, it will be that additional incremental cost will be passed on to the local jurisdiction. If NCTD would be unable to procure or maintain the liability insurance and the crossing is decommissioned, then that the local jurisdiction will bear all cost and expense for that decommissioning of that crossing. NCTD, though, reserves the right to maintain the crossing improvements and would be in turn responsible for those costs. And lastly, in the event of any claim or litigation, NCTD and the local jurisdiction will cooperate in good faith and seek a disposition by way of dismissal or summary judgment. This language will also be included in the license agreement. And so that wraps up Board Policy 18, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Sukhil, do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right, so at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. Are there any comments from the committee members? Yeah, sure.
So we have found the license agreements in the city of Encinitas to be really beneficial to us because we've been able to use the right of way, improve the right of way, in our opinion, make it safer, quieter, friendlier for the surrounding neighbors. I know that we've done it since I've been on council for the El Portal Undercross and then some of the parking, what do we call them? Parking bays that we've added. What are some other license agreements we might have had prior to that, aside from crossings, or was this the first time that we entered into such agreement with NCTD?
We have a number of crossing agreements, like just a regular crossing that you might have has to have an agreement as well. Rail trails are also things in the right of way that we would license and have some, I'm trying to think, Chesterfield, yeah.
So those were some of the earliest ones, the
Yes,
rail trail in
uh-huh.
Chesterfield. Great.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are lovely. I'd say they're some of the best areas around the rail and in our city alone. So they've been super helpful to us. And Board member Bob Patel and I have really enjoyed going for walks there and sort of understanding like how you can improve the area around it and amplify the public's use. And so it's been really great. So I just wanted to offer that as a comment. And I know it gets tricky around the legalese of these things, but from our perspective, we've worked really collaboratively with NCTD and that the best case scenario has always been achieved at those in those circumstances. So it's not a question, it's just to stay. Thank you for this effort. I think this is our last meeting. I didn't know that walking in here today. It's a little sad. But just my final comment is, I hope this is just the beginning of all the things that we hope to achieve, and really looking from a historic perspective, I think we're going to look back at this moment of time and the federal funds that have been created as a response to the pandemic. And so what I see from now on is that we'll just have more and more funding and more opportunities to keep working together. So thanks for the efforts that you've put into this. And yeah, we're looking forward to quiet zones and crossings and lovely spaces for all of us to enjoy. And efficient travel outside of your single occupant car.
I have a couple of questions. You talked about on page 2 about either North County Transit or Sandag are available to provide the project management. Who determines which way that goes?
So in the very beginning, with the project development, it's really conversations that we can have. It's usually very large projects like the undercrossings that we've had in the past in Encinitas. Sandag took on that project for construction. That's a great example because of their experience in working in the right of way compared to the city's expertise in that area.
So basically the city staff and North County Transit would be talking about what's the best path to go.
Yeah.
At whatever point in time.
Yeah.
And it could change between projects.
Yeah.
Okay.
All projects are different and the situations are different. As a general rule, we have the city as the lead agency, but we're open to discussions on the best approach.
Okay. And then when you were talking about the costs, the lead agency is responsible for that. It looks like, NCTD might contribute some funding. Who goes out and seeks the grant funding that might be available? Because it would seem to me that maybe North County Transit might be a little more experienced in that than maybe a local jurisdiction, and or might be able to combine projects or something. So who decides that?
Yeah, so again, that is discussions that we have with the local jurisdiction, and we establish those roles and responsibilities in the MOU. So if there are opportunities that we know of for grant funding or other projects that we know that are going on that could be combined in some way, we're going to have those discussions and then talk about who's going to lead in the efforts.
Okay. And then, I think always a big concern to all of us, is the liability. So did I hear you correctly when you said the liability more or less falls on the local jurisdiction?
For the indemnification for the city is responsible for, as it relates to the federal rules and the setting up of the crossing, let's say itself, and making sure that it is designed and constructed in accordance with federal regulation. That's the city's responsibility. Then NCTD has the responsibility of the actual improvements.
And then what about future liability? Should something happen at that crossing, is it a city liability, or is it like typical, everybody gets sued? Right? Okay, okay,
Yeah,
it's everybody.
I was gonna say in most instances, the city would be sued, NCTD would be sued. And the way the indemnification is set up in board policy 18, the city's liability is related to, as Tracy said, was there any negligent act or omission in the development and implementation of the quiet zone? And then with the construction or the license agreement, with the license agreement, NCTD takes responsibility for the actual physical infrastructure because we're going to be maintaining it after it's constructed.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
That's the way the indemnity is set up.
Thank you. That's all.
All right, any other questions, comments? Okay, it is my turn. So actually going off on that, what Board Member Jenkins said, so can you clarify who's in charge of the maintenance of these additional safety items?
So the non-railroad improvements, that maintenance is the responsibility of the local jurisdiction.
Okay.
But any actual railroad improvements, NCTD takes over.
Okay, so it would behoove the local jurisdiction to just make sure that they're up with the maintenance so that there's no, the sign is there, the gate is working. So that's probably something that when I'm thinking back at the manual discussion that we had, it would be nice to have just a brief outline of what the city should probably take into consideration as maintenance, because that could really help in a situation if God forbid there's a situation that happens. If the city's really on top of the maintenance, then that's probably going to be beneficial to the city when it comes to any kind of lawsuit or anything like that.
Within the manual, we can look at, while we can't estimate what your cost would be for that, but we could likely outline what that would typically include, signage, that type of.
Yeah, that would be great.
medians, that type of.
That'd be great. And any kind of language that would be like, and you should be maintaining these on a very constant, basis.
The one thing I would like to highlight is maintaining the height of the pavement. So sometimes when we repave, we add slurry, so it makes it taller. It's really important that we maintain the height of those curbs. So one of the things I'll make sure that we flag is that in the long term, as cities look to maintain their roadway systems, that they be cognizant of the curb heights, because obviously to replace a curve that could be very expensive in the future. So I just wanted to make sure.
Oh,
that
that's
we're-
great. Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that. Any little things like that actually make a big difference to our jurisdictions, because we need to be able to be forward thinking, and we don't get to just print our own money. So we have to be really diligent with the money and set funding aside to have regular maintenance. So if a jurisdiction isn't thinking like, oh, this is just a one-time cost and we don't really have to maintain it, you know, it has to be just kind of in your face, like, no, this is a one-time cost for putting the stuff in, and then there's an ongoing maintenance cost, just like with anything else, like you said, the roadway, right? But just having those kind of baked in, it's going to help our engineering department, planning, everybody who's involved. And then at some point, the council with a budget discussion to just really ensure that we are having best practices. So, okay, awesome. And I wanted to ask, so yeah, the whole time that we've been talking about, you know, how to partner between NCTD and the local jurisdictions, it's always been like, local jurisdiction, you're the lead agency. And we've been like really having a hard time grappling with that. So I want to say good job to everybody here on the board for really pushing to try and make sure that we have a very collaborative approach and that we're able to utilize NCTD's experience in doing this, because local jurisdictions, a lot of us, we don't have that in-house experience. We don't even necessarily know where to go to get it. So I feel like this is a fundamental change that I'm hearing. Not that it's set in stone, like, oh, Sandag and NCTD are going to be the lead agencies, but now I feel like there's a little bit more space to have that conversation about, hey, this is really going to enhance rail operations. It's going to help the city, but we as a local jurisdiction, as a city, we're not really sure where to go. And then we can have that conversation with NCTD, with Sandag, and there could potentially be, you know, the lead agency could maybe be more right-sized as NCTD or Sandag versus the city. So I really appreciate that, because I do see that as a fundamental change from the beginning of our conversations here at the RSCE committee to our final conversation being, you know, maybe more cognizant of capacity at our local jurisdiction. But we're still here to help, you know, fund the parts that we need to. But it's great to know that we have potentially more beneficial partnership that is going to help actualize some of these really big projects versus kind of like a pie in the sky dream that some of us have at our local cities, and we don't know how to move forward. So I just want to say I am super appreciative of getting to this point. And that's pretty much all I had. Any other questions, final comments? No? All right. Well, let me get back to my little script here. So there is no vote required for this item. It's informational only. This concludes our agenda for today and wraps up the mission of the RSCE committee. The formation of this ad hoc committee was approved by the NCTD Board of Directors in July of last year. And since then, we've received a lot of important information pertaining to rail safety and community enhancements that are important to all of our communities. The committee covered topics such as quiet zones, grade separated crossings and related laws, regulations and policies, and grant funding opportunities. And it discussed the possibilities for collaboration in North County, which is really, really important. There is an opportunity for us to continue our work together and to leverage historic funding levels, which I hear there might even be more funding coming through because there's a little thing called an election, to develop regionally significant projects and to help connect our communities. NCTD staff will continue to share grant opportunities as they become available and support local efforts to seek grant funding and advance projects. The most important first step is collaboration through the leadership of our local cities and the county. Finally, I'd like to thank Lillian Doherty for her contributions to this committee and helping us to complete the work plan the committee established in October of last year. Even though we had a lot of juggling and a lot of conversations about different things we wanted to see, I think, you know, this committee has really met and exceeded the expectations I had, especially, again, getting to this final informational item. I think it's great that we've seen this huge shift. So thank you very much. And I do have one final question about the RSCE committee. I know it's concluding, but in the case that we see it would be beneficial to bring it back to life, that's a discussion that the board could have, correct? Okay. Yeah, just, I mean, if we see a lot more funding on top of the funding that we have and a lot of movement at the local jurisdictions to try and capture this funding and really enhance our rail operations and community connectivity, I think it would be, you know, appropriate at that time for the board to consider perhaps reviving it. But thank you so much to all the board members. This has been a fantastic committee, and thank you to staff and everybody and the public for being engaged and wanting to enhance our communities. So y'all have a good one.
I just want to say one more thing. I just think we all want to thank you for being the chair. You've been a great chair. And so thank you for being willing to take that on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. This meeting is adjourned.